Quick! Someone call the cops. There's something wrong. It smells like something died in there.
It was a freezing Thursday morning in Dortmund, Germany. The hallway of apartment block 12 reeked of something foul, something rotting. Mrs. Kleinschmidt, Mark Vogel's elderly neighbor, stood outside apartment 42 with her sweater pulled over her nose. She hadn't seen Mark in days, and now this smell. It was unbearable. Police arrived within minutes, broke down the door, and what they found inside was something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Before we go deeper, if you love true stories about humans and the wild crossing paths, with shocking, emotional, and sometimes tragic consequences, don't forget to subscribe to Animal Story. We dive into the darkest corners of human-animal relationships. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss what happens next. The scene inside apartment 42 didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a chamber from hell. Cobwebs thick as curtains hung from the ceiling. Dozens of terrariums, some cracked open, lined the walls, filled with all kinds of nightmarish creatures. Venomous snakes, hairy tarantulas, and twitching scorpions. They moved freely across the floor, the furniture, the kitchen sink, and in the middle of it all was Mark Vogel, or what was left of him. His body lay on the floor, partly decomposed. His skin had been gnawed at, his eyes long gone. His chest showed bite marks, small, neat, circular, and several limbs were partially devoured. Crawling over his remains were black widow spiders, their slick abdomens gleaming under the flashlight beams. A massive boa constrictor coiled silently, near the couch. No one could speak for a full minute. One officer reportedly threw up in the hallway. Another muttered under his breath, "This isn't a home. This is a nest." News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Tabloids called it the Spider House death. Others dubbed Mark the man who loved monsters. But the truth, as always, was more complicated and more human. You see, to understand what really happened that day inside apartment 42, we have to go back to where it all began. Long before his name made headlines across Europe, Mark Vogel was just a quiet man trying to make sense of a world that had never really made space. For him, he was born in 1973 in Dortmund, Germany, but his story could have just as easily happened in a small American town. You know the kind, where everyone waves at each other but no one really knows anyone. From an early age, Mark was different. While other kids played soccer or chased each other around playgrounds, Mark knelt in the dirt, watching ants carry crumbs 10 times their size. At age 9, he caught his first tarantula on a school field trip and kept it in a shoebox under his bed. Most kids would have screamed. Mark gave it a name: Luna. It wasn't just fascination, it was connection. His parents didn't understand. Teachers called him distracted. Classmates teased him mercilessly. Bug boy, creep, the one who talks to spiders. And so Mark did what a lot of sensitive kids do when the world turns cruel. He pulled away. By the time he was in his 20s, Mark was living alone and working as a freelance electronics technician. He barely spoke unless necessary, never caused trouble, always paid rent on time. His apartment was tucked into the 3rd floor of an aging building with thin walls and flickering hallway lights. To most people, he was invisible. But inside apartment 42, Mark had built his sanctuary. Terrariums lined the walls like trophies, each one meticulously labeled, cleaned, and cared for. His collection was more than a hobby. It was a life's devotion. Black widows, emperor scorpions, rattlesnakes, he didn't keep them for thrill or status. He kept them because they were misunderstood like him. He fed them by hand, spoke to them like family. At night, he read books about them, watched documentaries, posted to obscure internet forums where people traded tips on housing exotic species. Some of his online friends were in the U.S., guys in Texas or Arizona who raised cobras or had whole garages turned into reptile havens. They talked about safety precautions, feeding routines, molting schedules, but the one thing Mark never talked about was loneliness. You could feel it in his space, though. The couch was always covered in books and tools. The fridge had barely any food, no pictures on the wall, except for one. A framed photo of a young Mark holding Luna, his first tarantula. That image said everything. This was a man who had poured all his love into creatures that the world ran from. The few neighbors who had spoken to him said he was polite, soft-spoken, even helpful when asked. Mrs. Kleinschmidt once locked herself out and Mark climbed through her window to let her in. Another time he helped a boy fix a broken drone. But mostly, he kept to himself. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't strange. He was lonely. And like so many people who feel forgotten by the world, Mark found meaning in the only place he felt in control. His relationship with creatures that didn't judge him, didn't ask questions, didn't walk away. He once wrote on a forum post, "They don't betray. They don't lie. They only respond to how you treat them." To him, they weren't just animals. They were truth. And while most people saw danger behind glass walls, Mark saw loyalty. He believed, truly, that with enough love, any living thing could feel safe and make you feel safe in return. But as we're about to see, some instincts don't stay behind glass. If you had stepped inside Mark Vogel's apartment in those early months of 2003, you might have thought you'd walked into a mad scientist's lab or a small jungle from a nightmare. But to Mark, it was home. He had names for all his creatures. Isabella was the black widow he raised from an egg sac. Dagger was a rattlesnake that only ate when Mark fed him directly. Salem was a pitch-black scorpion that liked to rest motionless on a heat rock for hours. He didn't keep them locked away like dangerous trophies. He let some roam free inside the apartment. He trusted them, completely. And somehow, they seemed to trust him too. At night, Mark would sit in his chair by the window, a warm lamp glowing beside him, with a tarantula crawling up his forearm as he read. When he worked on circuit boards or repaired small devices for neighbors, a snake might be coiled lazily on a nearby bookshelf. Most people couldn't imagine living like that. But to Mark, this wasn't weird. It was peaceful. No noise, no judgment. Just the gentle rhythm of heat lamps clicking on and off, the rustle of reptile skin, and the quiet companionship of creatures most people feared. Once in a while, Mark would post videos to a niche online forum. These weren't viral clips, just dimly lit recordings of him hand-feeding his widow spiders or letting a scorpion crawl across his open palm. But one of those clips made it further than he expected. A German late-night documentary team picked it up. They were doing a segment on extreme pet owners and reached out to interview Mark. At first, he said no. He didn't like cameras, didn't like being the center of attention. But eventually, he agreed, under one condition. Don't make it look like I'm crazy. I love them, that's all. The segment aired on local TV and made its way online. Some viewers were horrified. Others were fascinated. A few people called him a genius. More called him insane. But something about the way Mark spoke on camera stuck with people. He didn't sound like a thrill-seeker or a man showing off. He spoke softly, calmly, with real affection in his voice. "They're not monsters," he said. "They just want to survive. Like you. Like me." Soon, he had a small group of online followers. Other animal lovers, misfits, collectors of the strange and misunderstood. Some from Germany, some from the US. One woman from Montana sent him a handwritten letter calling him the bravest man I've never met. Mark didn't care much about fame, but he liked knowing there were others out there who didn't think he was a freak. The deeper his bond grew with his animals, the more isolated he became from the rest of the world. He barely went out. Grocery runs turned into quick dashes to the corner store. Even his work slowed down. Why bother with the outside world, he figured, when everything he needed was right here, purring, hissing, crawling, and safe. To Mark, this was more than a bond. It was destiny. He used to say, "I'm not alone, I've got 100 little hearts beating in this apartment with me." And no matter how many times friends warned him, no one can ever truly control something wild, he would simply smile and shake his head. Because Mark didn't see wildness. He saw loyalty. He believed with every fiber of his being that what he had built, this strange, crawling, whispering world, was unbreakable. But nature doesn't make promises, and trust, once given blindly, can come back to bite. The first sign was easy to dismiss. One night, Mark found a smashed terrarium on the floor. A heat lamp had overheated, cracked the glass, and a desert scorpion had escaped. He found it under his laundry hamper, completely still. No big deal, he mumbled, returning it gently to its new enclosure. Accidents happen. But the next week, another tank tipped, this time the one that housed Isabella, his prized black widow. She hadn't escaped, but her silk web had collapsed. She curled in the corner, aggressive and twitchy. Mark chalked it up to mating stress. Still, something about her posture gave him pause. That night, he locked her tank for the first time in months. Then came the bite. It was mid-October. Mark had been cleaning the inside of Dagger's enclosure. The rattlesnake, he swore, knew his scent better than any other. For a second, just 1 second, he forgot to tap the glass first. Dagger struck. The fangs barely grazed the back of Mark's hand, but his skin flared up immediately. He wrapped it in gauze, stayed home from work, and told no one, not even his online community. It was the first time Mark felt fear, not of the snake, but of what that moment might mean. A few days later, Mrs. Kleinschmidt caught him in the stairwell, looking pale and sweating. She asked if he was okay. "I'm fine," Mark replied, voice shaky. "Just the flu." She stared at the wrapped hand and narrowed her eyes. "Mark, those animals of yours, they're dangerous." He shook his head. "They're not mine. They're family." She didn't press further, but word started to spread. The building's landlord knocked on his door later that week. He'd gotten complaints, scratching noises through the walls, a foul smell near the vents, someone claiming they'd seen a snake's tail near the stairwell. "Need to know what you're keeping in here, Mark," the man said. Mark stepped outside, closed the door behind him, and calmly said, "They're contained. Nothing is out of place." The landlord raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" Mark smiled politely. "I'm the only one who understands them." That was the problem. Mark believed too deeply. He believed he could read their moods, predict their behavior, love them into gentleness. When a friend from his online forum warned him about overpopulating a small space with high-risk creatures, Mark brushed it off. "They're not just venom and fangs," he typed back. "They have rhythms, emotions. If you treat them right, they know." But even his animals seemed different lately. The snakes hissed more, refused food. The scorpions began digging furiously, tearing up their own burrows. One tarantula tried to bite through its screen lid. The most unsettling was Isabella. She'd stopped responding to Mark's voice. Her web patterns changed, chaotic, dense. She no longer hung in the open. She hid, lurked, waited. Mark noticed, but he didn't accept. He started spending longer hours awake at night, walking barefoot across the apartment, watching them. His journal filled with scribbled notes, feeding charts, humidity logs, molting cycles. Every time something seemed off, he'd write it down and explain it away. One forum user from Arizona messaged him privately, "Man, I know you love them. But love won't stop a black widow when it's hungry. You need to scale back." Mark never responded. He didn't want to scale back. He didn't want fewer creatures. He wanted more. He'd crossed some invisible line between admiration and obsession, between safety and delusion, but to him it was still love. When a friend asked if he ever felt nervous sleeping in a room with nearly 100 deadly animals, Mark just laughed. If they wanted to hurt me, they would have done it already. He believed that, with all his heart. But what Mark didn't realize was this. In nature, trust is a one-way mirror. You can look in and feel connection. But on the other side, something might only see prey. It was a Sunday evening in early January. Snow dusted the rooftops of Dortmund like powdered sugar, and the streets below were quiet, still, almost peaceful. Inside apartment 42, however, something was unraveling. Mark had spent most of the day rearranging his terrariums, adjusting heat lamps, changing bedding, cleaning glass. He was sweating from the warmth of the room even though it was freezing outside. Dozens of eyes followed his every move, cold, unblinking, watching. That night, Mark lit a candle, something he almost never did. Maybe it was the holidays. Maybe he was just tired of the buzzing overhead lights. He sat cross-legged on the floor right in the middle of it all, surrounded by tanks, by webs, by movement. In his hand, a worn paperback book. Across his lap, Isabella's tank sat open. She hadn't eaten in days. He whispered to her, voice low, gentle. "Come on, sweetheart. Just a little meal, then you can rest." Mark extended a long cotton swab with a piece of raw meat at the end, something he'd done dozens of times. Isabella stepped forward, mechanical and slow. She paused just inches from his hand. And then, she lunged. It was fast, almost too fast to register. Her fangs sank into the web-thin skin between his thumb and forefinger. Mark yelped, dropping the swab. His whole body jerked back, knocking over the candle. The flame flickered and fell into a mess of newspaper clippings on the floor. Panic. He slapped his hand against his pants, heart racing, but it was already swelling. The pain hit like fire, sharp, stabbing, spreading up his wrist. He staggered to his feet, dizzy. The candle's flame caught something dry. A hiss of smoke followed. The room was suddenly alive with motion. Creatures stirred in their tanks, snakes slithered, scorpions climbed. And then came the sound Mark feared most. Glass shattering. One of the tanks had tipped over. The rattlesnake. Dagger. Then another. The scorpions. A third tank fell, an entire cluster of baby tarantulas. It was chaos. Mark stumbled backward, clutching his wrist. His vision was tunneling. Breathing became ragged. The venom was moving fast. He tried to crawl toward the phone, but the floor was alive beneath him. Tiny legs, claws, scales. He screamed, not in fear, but betrayal. "No, no, I love you. I raised you." He reached the counter, knocked the phone to the floor, tried to dial. No signal. No time. He collapsed onto his side, eyes wide in the dim light. The ceiling above him was covered in thick webs. Something moved across it. The last thing Mark saw was Isabella, watching from the shadows of the ceiling. Not affectionate, not grateful, just waiting. It wasn't until 4 days later that anyone knocked on his door. Neighbors had noticed the smell. First it was faint, then unbearable. Police arrived with masks, assuming they were dealing with a gas leak or a dead animal. But when they broke down the door, what they walked into was far worse. The heat lamps had kept the apartment warm, turning it into a jungle. Over 50 creatures had escaped their tanks. Snakes coiled beneath furniture. Tarantulas clung to windows. Scorpions scuttled freely across the carpet. And there, in the center of it all, was what remained of Mark Vogel. His body was bloated, discolored, partially decomposed. One arm was nearly stripped of flesh. His face was unrecognizable. The autopsy would later show multiple venom types in his system, but no one could say which one killed him, or if it had even been venom at all. One investigator described the apartment as a war zone made of silk and scales. "I've never seen anything like it." He wasn't just killed, he was consumed. Mark had trusted them, cared for them, fed them. But in the end, nature didn't care about love. What lived in that apartment had no memory of kindness, no concept of family. It only knew hunger and instinct. And in that final tragic moment, Mark learned the hardest lesson of all. You can't tame what was never meant to be touched. The news broke slowly, then all at once. Man-eaten by own exotic pets. Black Widow horror in apartment 42. Deadly zoo discovered in German flat. At first it sounded like some urban legend, a creepypasta gone viral. But it wasn't fiction. Mark Vogel was real, and so was the horror of what happened to him. Photos surfaced of the crime scene. Not graphic ones, but enough. Enough to see the tanks, some shattered, some overturned. Enough to see the warning signs that, in hindsight, everyone missed. The animal forums lit up with debate. Some members mourned him. Others called him reckless. And outside that small apartment in Dortmund, a crowd gathered. Neighbors, reporters, strangers drawn in by morbid curiosity. Candles and flowers piled up by the gate. Someone taped a note to the door. You loved them too much. They loved you not enough. The authorities moved quickly. A biohazard team entered the apartment wearing full protective gear. The surviving animals, over 200 in total, were collected. Many had to be euthanized. Some were too venomous to transport safely. Others were simply too aggressive. One official described the apartment as a biological minefield. Mark was living in a death trap disguised as a sanctuary. Back in the States, the story sparked heated conversations. Talk shows and podcasts picked it up. Reddit threads dissected it. YouTubers made videos titled "Why Exotic Pets Will Kill You" and "This Man Loved Spiders to Death." But not everyone judged him harshly. Some people saw a man who was simply too alone in the world. A man who gave his heart to creatures because humans had always turned him away. A man who believed love was enough. Dr. Emily Harper, a zoologist from Oregon, said it best in an interview. He wasn't crazy, he was devoted, but devotion without limits becomes obsession, and obsession in the animal kingdom can be fatal. Neighbors in his building were left shaken. Mrs. Kleinschmidt, the woman who'd once been helped through a locked door by Mark, cried on camera. He wasn't a monster, he was sweet, just lost. The landlord, who'd warned him weeks before, couldn't even step inside after the police finished. It still smells like heat lamps and fear, he told reporters. So what do we take from all this? Was Mark Vogel a cautionary tale? A martyr for misunderstood creatures? A man whose kindness went too far? One thing's clear, what happened to him wasn't sudden. It was a slow unraveling, built on trust, fed by denial, sealed by nature's unforgiving rules. The creatures didn't turn on Mark because they were evil. They did what they were wired to do. They followed instinct. And no matter how much Mark loved them, they were never built to love him back. His story lingers, not just because of its horror, but because of its heartbreak. Because somewhere in some quiet neighborhood, someone else might be building their own little sanctuary, feeding it with affection, protecting it with hope, blind to the danger that waits when love ignores instinct. And that leaves us with one final question. Do you believe love is enough to change something truly wild, or do we risk everything when we try to humanize what was never meant to be tamed? If this story made you think, feel, or question anything, hit that like button and subscribe to Animal Story. We bring you true, emotional, and sometimes terrifying tales where the line between man and animal gets blurred. We'll see you in the next one. But for now, watch your instincts.